made a wild resolution at midnight. The unexpected fallout changed my life. I have to get this off my chest, even though I know it makes me sound horrible. My name is Sarah, and I've been married to my husband Jake for 7 years. You know how people always say marriage is about love and understanding? Well, I thought I understood that, but I realize now I never truly did. I messed up, and I need to talk about it. I don't know why, but it's been eating me up inside, and maybe writing this will help me feel a little better. Or maybe it won't. I don't know. So, Jake and I have always been pretty different. He's calm and steady, and I'm, well, not. I've always liked shiny things, big things, and things that make me feel special. Jake likes simple stuff. He's the kind of guy who finds joy in the little things, like a nice sunset or a good book. And me, I've always wanted more. I wanted excitement, sparkle, and to feel like I was the center of the universe. That's just who I am. When we first got married, I thought he would change. I thought he'd learn to love the same things I did, and that he'd start spoiling me like in those fairy tales where the prince gives the princess everything her heart desires. But that never really happened. Don't get me wrong, Jake has always been good to me. He works hard, he takes care of me, and he loves me in his own way. But his way isn't what I wanted. Every year, on holidays or birthdays, Jake would get me something nice. Not amazing, just nice. Like one time, he got me a necklace for Valentine's Day. It wasn't super expensive, but it was pretty. I remember holding it and thinking it wasn't shiny enough or big enough. I felt disappointed, even though I didn't say anything. But inside, I started to feel like he didn't care enough. I wanted grand gestures, big surprises, and things that made me feel like I was living in a dream. Jake just didn't do that. I tried to talk to him about it a few times. I told him I wanted more high-life romance, more expensive gifts, and more over-the-top excitement. He would always listen, but then he'd say something like, "I want to make you happy, but I don't think happiness comes from things." That frustrated me so much because for me, happiness did come from things. I wanted him to understand that, but he never did. He kept being himself, and I started to resent him for it. Over time, I noticed myself pulling away from Jake. I stopped appreciating the little things he did, like making me coffee in the morning, or leaving sweet notes for me when he went to work. Those things didn't feel like enough. I started daydreaming about being with someone else, someone who would treat me like a queen and give me all the things I wanted. I know it's awful, but that's how I felt. And little by little, my nature kept eating at me and my marriage until one Christmas, a few years into our marriage, Jake got me a really nice bracelet. It was beautiful, but I was hoping for something bigger, like a trip to Paris or a diamond ring. I tried to hide my disappointment, but I think he could tell. I remember him looking at me with this sad expression, and instead of feeling bad, I felt angry. I thought, why can't he just get it right? Why can't he make me feel special? Things started to get worse after that. I stopped pretending to be happy with his gifts, and I started comparing him to other people. I'd see friends posting about their husbands buying them fancy cars or taking them on luxurious vacations, and I'd get so jealous. I started telling myself that I deserved better, that Jake wasn't enough for me. I started to feel like I was falling out of love with him. I wanted to feel like I was on top of the world, but my husband was like an anchor dragging me down to an abyss. Reminiscing about the whole thing now, I think I hated Jake for not spending unnecessarily on me. I knew we had bills and important things to do with money, but I didn't care. I just wanted to feel like the cherry on top of the icing, and that led to serious problems. Then came Christmas last year. I had dropped a lot of hints about what I wanted, a flashy new car. Not just any car, but something expensive and luxurious, like the ones celebrities drive, the type that cost a few $100,000 and above. I even circled pictures of the car in magazines and left them lying around the house. I thought Jake would finally get the message and give me the kind of gift I'd been dreaming of for years. I mean, he couldn't be that clueless. On Christmas morning, I was so excited. I just knew he was going to surprise me with the car I wanted. When he handed me a set of car keys, I felt my heart race. I ran outside, expecting to see the car of my dreams, parked in the driveway. And there was a car, but it wasn't the one I wanted. It was nice and new, but it wasn't flashy or expensive. It wasn't a sports car, neither was it a luxury car, Nor did it look like something a celebrity would drive. It was practical, something Jake probably thought made sense for us. I felt my face get hot, and I could feel the disappointment bubbling up inside me. Instead of saying thank you or pretending to be happy, I lost it. I started yelling at him, asking why he couldn't get me what I really wanted. I told him I deserved better and that he didn't understand me. I went on, saying things I knew would hurt him, but I didn't care at that moment. I was so wrapped up in my own feelings that I didn't stop to think about how much I was hurting him. Jake just stood there looking at me with this expression I'll never forget. It was a mix of sadness and something else I couldn't quite place. He didn't argue with me or try to explain himself. He just said he was sorry and went back inside. I stayed outside fuming and pacing, not even looking at the car he had given me. All I could think about was how unfair it was that I didn't get what I wanted. In anger, I threw the key at the side of the door, causing a little scratch on the perfect paint job. I didn't feel an ounce of remorse. I'd never known how long he saved for that car or what he had to sacrifice to get it, and I didn't care. I don't know how long I stayed out there, but when I finally went back inside, Jake was sitting on the couch, looking so defeated. I didn't say anything to him, and he didn't say anything to me. We spent the rest of Christmas in silence, and I could feel this wall growing between us. But even then, I didn't feel bad. I felt justified. I told myself he should have known better, that he should have tried harder to make me happy. After the disaster on Christmas morning, I couldn't calm down. The whole day felt ruined, and honestly, I felt trapped in my life with Jake. I spent hours in my room sulking, thinking about how unfair everything was. I kept telling myself that I deserved more, that I should have someone who could make me feel like the queen I wanted to be. Jake didn't try to talk to me. He stayed out of my way, probably trying to avoid another fight. That evening, I decided I wasn't going to sit around and be miserable. I needed to feel alive, so I got dressed in my best outfit, did my makeup, and headed out. I didn't even tell Jake where I was going because honestly, I didn't care. Can you imagine it? Leaving your spouse at home alone during the holidays, and not for any good reason? I drove the wacky car that Jake gave me to a club in the city where the music was loud enough to filter out my angry thoughts, and the energy felt electric. But most importantly, there was alcohol for me to drown my rage in. It was the kind of place that made me forget everything for a little while. At the club, I ordered a fancy drink and started dancing. The music felt like it was vibrating through my whole body, and I could feel people watching me. I loved it. I loved being the center of attention, and I loved how it made me feel special. And I was wearing a revealing dress that was just enough to pull every single attention in the club, both from thirsty men and jealous women. As I danced, some guys started coming over, trying to talk to me and impress me. I let them. It felt good to have people chasing after me, even though I knew deep down it was wrong. One of the guys stood out more than the rest. His name was Brian, and he had this air of confidence that caught my attention. He wasn't just trying to impress me with words. He was throwing money around like it didn't matter. He was buying drinks for everyone, tipping the bartenders big, and making sure I noticed him. I did. When he came over to me, I didn't hold back. I flirted with him shamelessly, and he loved it. He told me he liked me, and I saw this as my chance. I told him I didn't hang out with cheap guys, which was a very materialistic thing to say. He laughed like that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Then he said he wasn't cheap, and his pockets were deep. That was all I needed to hear. From that moment, I started spending time with Brian. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't care. Jake was at home, probably feeling miserable, but I didn't even think about him. I was too busy enjoying the attention and the gifts. Brian took me to expensive restaurants where the food looked like art, and the waiters treated me like royalty. He made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. The days between Christmas and New Year's Eve flew by in a blur of fancy dinners, shopping trips, and late-night drives in Brian's luxurious car. I didn't think about Jake much. I told myself he was fine, that he probably didn't even notice I was gone most of the time. I knew that was a lie, but I didn't want to face the truth. I was having too much fun to care. By the time New Year's Eve rolled around, I was completely caught up in the life Brian was showing me. He invited me to his house for a party that night, and I couldn't say no. His house was massive, with high ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, and a view of the city that took my breath away. It was the kind of place I had always dreamed of living in, and being there made me feel like I was living someone else's life. I felt the urge to curse Jake for imprisoning me in a domesticated life. It thought it was beneath me, and that was what I suffered for years. The party was everything I wanted. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and everyone there seemed rich and glamorous. Brian stayed by my side the whole night, making sure I had everything I wanted. At one point, he pulled me aside and led me to a quieter part of the house. We talked, laughed, and then things got more intimate. I didn't stop it. I didn't even hesitate. I wish I could go back and pull myself away from him, but we can't take back our actions. I remember how I kissed Brian like I was trying to prove a point. I didn't hold back. Instead, I gave it my all, and Brian's hands kept going all around me like they were starved, and my skin was all that could satisfy them. He did things to me that Jake had never done, and I loved every second of it. I felt like I was floating. I was living this life that made me feel untouchable, that made me feel as though I had no problems in life. Afterward, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me felt guilty, but a bigger part of me felt powerful. I told myself Jake would never find out, and even if he did, it was his fault for not giving me what I wanted. Brian made me feel special, and I wanted more of that feeling. Before I left that night, Brian handed me a small box. When I opened it, I saw a necklace inside. It sparkled like nothing I had ever owned before, and I knew it had to be expensive. He told me this was just the beginning, that if I stayed with him, there would be more gifts and more excitement. When I got back home that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was tired, but also jittery from everything that had happened with Brian. My heart was still racing, and my head was spinning with thoughts of the luxurious world he had shown me. I could still feel the weight of the expensive necklace he had given me resting against my skin. I didn't want to take it off. It felt like proof that I could have the life I always wanted if I just played my cards right. As I walked into the house, it was quiet. Too quiet. Jake was sitting in the living room with a look on his face that I didn't like. It was serious and tired, like he had been waiting for me for hours, which he probably had. I knew he wanted to talk, and I knew it wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. I didn't want to deal with it, but I couldn't just ignore him. So I braced myself, but not to apologize. I had no intention of saying sorry. He asked me where I had been, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. He looked hurt, like he was trying to understand why I had been gone so much lately. But instead of feeling guilty, I got defensive. I told him I had been spending time with people who valued me enough, people who knew how to treat me the way I deserved to be treated. The words came out sharp, and I could see the sting in his eyes, but I didn't stop. I was too caught up in my own anger and self-righteousness. Jake didn't take that well. He started asking more questions, his voice rising with every word. I felt cornered, so I started yelling back. I told him he had no right to question me when he couldn't even give me the kind of life I wanted. I told him I was tired of feeling unimportant, tired of being married to someone who didn't understand me. The argument spiraled out of control so fast that I barely even knew what I was saying anymore. We kept going back and forth, saying things we couldn't take back. But honestly, most of the hurtful stuff came from me. I was furious, and I wanted him to feel as bad as I did. I told him he was boring and cheap, and that I couldn't believe I had settled for someone like him. I even called him worthless. I could see the pain in his face every time I said something cruel, but instead of stopping, I kept going. I felt like I had to win the argument, no matter what. The fight dragged on for hours, and neither of us was willing to back down. By the middle of the night, I was exhausted, but I was still angry. I was so angry that I said something I probably shouldn't have. I told him that since he had made up his mind to be stingy and boring, I had made up my mind too. I told him I had decided to open up our marriage, and I said it in a way that was meant to hurt him. I told him I wanted to go out with people who were more interesting, people who were willing to spend money on me and treat me like I deserved to be treated. I told him that if he didn't like it, we could just get a divorce. The words felt heavy as I said them, but I didn't take them back. I was too proud and too caught up in my own anger to admit that I might have gone too far. I was too nonchalant and unbelievable. Perhaps that was why Jake went silent after I said that. The next day was New Year's Day, and I didn't feel like staying home. Jake and I hadn't spoken since our fight the night before, and the tension in the house was unbearable. So I got dressed and went to see Brian. I didn't tell Jake where I was going, and I didn't care if he noticed. In my mind, I had already decided that I deserved better, and I was convinced Brian was the answer to all my problems. When I got to Brian's place, he greeted me with his usual charm and confidence. Being with him felt so easy, like I didn't have to think about anything else. We spent the whole day together, and it was intimate and exciting in a way that made me forget everything else. I told myself this was what I had been missing, what I deserved all along. After that day, Brian suggested we go on a trip to celebrate the new year. He said it would be a chance for me to relax and enjoy myself without any worries. I agreed without hesitation. I didn't even think about Jake or how he might feel about me being gone. I packed my bags and left with Brian, telling myself that this was the start of a better life. The trip was amazing at first. Brian spared no expense and everything felt so luxurious. We stayed in a fancy hotel with huge windows that looked out over the ocean, and every meal was a feast. I felt like I was living in a dream, and I didn't want it to end. For 4 days, it was just me and Brian, and I convinced myself that this was the life I had always wanted. But on the last day of the trip, everything changed. I woke up in the hotel room, and Brian was gone. At first, I thought he had just gone to get coffee or something, but then I realized my phone was missing. I started searching the room, and that's when I noticed my wallet was empty. All the cash I had brought was gone, and so were my cards. My car keys were also missing, the car Jake got for me. My heart started racing as I checked everywhere, but there was nothing. I tried to stay calm, but the panic was setting in fast. I called out for Brian, hoping he was just in another part of the hotel, but he didn't answer. I went down to the front desk to ask if they had seen him, but no one knew where he was. I even tried asking around the area, but it was like he had disappeared. I felt completely stranded. I didn't have any money, and I didn't know how I was going to get home. I tried calling someone from the hotel phone, but I didn't know anyone's number by heart. It was humiliating and terrifying all at once. I felt like a fool for trusting Brian, but there was nothing I could do about it now. Eventually, I managed to get help from a kind stranger who noticed how distressed I was. They gave me enough money to catch a bus back home, and I was so grateful, even though I felt like I didn't deserve it. The whole ride home, I kept thinking about how stupid I had been, and how everything was falling apart. When I finally got home, I expected Jake to be there, maybe waiting for me with questions or anger. But the house was quiet, too quiet. I walked through the rooms, calling out his name, but there was no answer. Then I started noticing what was missing. Some of the furniture was gone, along with his clothes and other belongings. The house felt empty, like he had taken a piece of it with him when he left. That's when it hit me. Jake had moved out. He had taken what he could and left while I was off chasing a life that wasn't real. I felt the weight of it all crashing down on me, and I couldn't hold back the tears. I fell to my knees right there in the middle of the empty living room, crying like I had never cried before. Update. After I came home to an empty house and found that Jake had moved out, I thought things couldn't get worse. But they did. For 1 whole week, I tried to reach him with my old phone that I had abandoned. I called and texted over and over, but there was no response. It was like he had vanished. I didn't even know where he was staying. At first, I told myself he just needed time to cool off, but as the days passed, it became clear he didn't want to talk to me at all. I spent the entire week alone in that house, which felt colder and emptier with every passing day. I kept replaying everything in my head, our fight, the things I said, the way I left. I wanted to blame him, but deep down I knew this was my fault. Still, I couldn't let go of my anger. I kept telling myself that he should have fought harder for me, that if he had been more generous and exciting, none of this would have happened. But even with all those thoughts swirling in my head, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Brian had disappeared too easily. I tried calling him, but his number didn't work. I thought maybe he had just lost his phone or changed his number, so I decided to go to his mansion. I told myself I would confront him, demand an explanation, and maybe get some of my things back. When I got to the mansion, I was ready to be angry, but what I found shocked me. The house was empty. There were no cars in the driveway, no signs of life anywhere. A real estate agent was there, showing the property to a couple, and I asked her where Brian was. She looked at me like I was crazy and told me the house had been on the market for months. It didn't belong to anyone named Brian. Hearing that felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I couldn't believe it. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of it. How could the house not be his? He had thrown parties there, invited me over, acted like he owned the place. None of it made sense. The realization hit me all at once. Brian wasn't who he said he was. He was a liar, and I had fallen for it completely. I got back in the taxi that brought me and left in a daze. My head was spinning, and I couldn't stop thinking about how stupid I had been. How could I have trusted him so easily? I threw away everything that was valuable to me for someone who wasn't even real. I suddenly got the urge to check the necklace he gave me, so I went to a jewelry shop where I showed them the necklace, and they told me that it was fake. A really good fake because it really looked real. I couldn't believe it. I wanted the earth to swallow me. I practically ran out of the shop. When I got home, the surprises weren't over. My parents were there, sitting in the living room with expressions that made it clear I was in trouble. They didn't even let me get a word in before they started telling me how embarrassed they were by my behavior. They had heard about Jake leaving and the mess I had made of my life, and they weren't holding back. Hearing them talk like that made me feel small and ashamed, but I didn't have the energy to defend myself. I just stood there, taking it all in, wishing I could disappear. After they left, I went to my room, hoping for a moment of peace, but that wasn't in the cards either. I opened my laptop to check my accounts, thinking maybe I could distract myself by planning how to rebuild. But when I logged in, I froze. My accounts were empty, every single one of them. Savings, checking, everything gone. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. Brian hadn't just lied about who he was, he had stolen from me too. I sat there staring at the screen, unable to breathe. All the money I had worked for, everything I had saved, it was all gone. I felt the tears start to come, and before I knew it, I was sobbing uncontrollably. I couldn't believe this was my life. I had lost my husband, my home, my money, and my dignity, all because of my own selfishness and stupidity. Update. It's been 3 months since my world fell apart, and somehow it keeps getting worse. Every day feels like a punishment, and I can't escape the mess I've made of my life. After Brian scammed me and left me broke, I thought things couldn't get lower, but I was wrong. A few weeks ago, I received divorce papers from Jake. I stared at them for hours, unable to process what was happening. I thought maybe there was still a chance. Maybe he would come back, or at least we could talk. But those papers were the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. It was over, and I knew I had no one to blame but myself. At first, I didn't want to sign them. I told myself it wasn't fair. I told myself that after everything, I deserved at least some of the property, maybe some money to help me get back on my feet. I was completely broke, and the thought of having nothing terrified me. So I made the decision to fight for it. Looking back, I can't believe how shameless I was. I dragged Jake into court, knowing full well that I didn't deserve anything. I made every excuse I could think of, saying I had contributed to the marriage, that I needed support, that he owed me something. But the truth was, I was just desperate. I wasn't fighting because I had a right to anything. I was fighting because I didn't know what else to do. Jake didn't say much during the process, but his mother did. She looked at me with so much disgust, and I could tell she was furious. At one point, she told me that I had no shame, and she was absolutely right. I didn't have any. I was willing to do whatever it took to get something out of this mess, even if it meant humiliating myself further. In the end, it didn't matter. I lost. I don't even know how, but I lost everything. The judge ruled in Jake's favor, and I walked away with nothing. No money, no property, nothing to show for the 7 years we were married. I didn't even have the energy to be angry. I just felt empty, like there was nothing left inside me. After that, things went downhill fast. I had already been struggling to keep my job, but after the court case, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept making mistakes, missing deadlines, and forgetting important tasks. My boss tried to be patient, but eventually they had enough. They let me go, and I can't blame them. I was a mess, and I wasn't doing my job properly. Now, I'm sitting in this tiny apartment that I can barely afford, surrounded by bills I can't pay and memories I can't escape. I keep thinking about all the decisions that led me here, all the times I put myself first and hurt the people who cared about me. I keep replaying everything in my head, wishing I could go back and do things differently, but it's too late. I'm in constant regret, and I hate myself for what I've done. I hate the person I became, the person who threw away a good life for greed and selfishness. I lost everything: my husband, my money, my job, my dignity, and it's all my fault. I don't know what the future holds for me, but right now it feels like there's no way out of this hole I've dug for myself. I'm trying to move forward, but it's hard when all I feel is regret and shame. All I can do now is live with the consequences of my choices and hope that one day I'll find a way to forgive myself.